Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My dear students, colleagues, and my fellow members, in this video I am going to explain theoretical perspectives and models of development. Scheme of the presentation is that I will discuss understanding development theory and strategy, and then we will discuss how various authors have differently categorized development theories. Then there are four broad approaches: periods of dominant theories, models of development. So we start with understanding development theory. Development theories are sets of logical propositions which seek to explain how development has occurred in the past and or should occur in the future. A development theories can either be normative or positive. A theory is normative when it generalizes about what should be done to achieve development. On the other hand, a theory is positive when it prescribes what has actually happened in the process of development. The theories, approaches, and models that are discussed here will be located in these two broad contexts. A positive explanation describes a phenomenon which is based on observable facts and data, essentially starting with what is, while a normative explanation expresses an opinion or value judgment about what should be there or what ought to, often including words like should and cannot be definitively proven or disproven based on evidence alone. Development strategies are the practical paths to development which may be pursued by international agencies, states, and non-governmental organizations as well as community-based organizations in an effort to stimulate change within particular nations, regions, countries, and continents. Early perspectives on development, both in theory and practice, concerned with economic growth, but subsequent approaches emphasized political, social, ethnic, cultural, ecological, and other dimensions of development. There are different categorization of development. Different authors have differently categorized different theories, approaches, and models. Tudero and Smith have classified them in four different classifications, and these constitute linear stage and growth theory, structural change theory, dependency theory, and new classical counter-revolution. On the other hand, Porter et al. Use a different categorization as follows, and that includes the classical traditional theory, the historical empirical approach, the radical dependency theories, and the alternative bottom-up theories. Others have looked at the development debate in terms of models, and these include modernization model, growth-oriented development model, distributed development model, human development model, as well as sustainable development model. And then there is also indigenous development model. So there are competing strands of thought regarding models of development. The classic post-World War II literature on economic development has been dominated by four major and sometimes competing strands of thought, and these include the linear stages of growth model, and within that we have the famous Rostow 5 stages of model as well as the Harrod-Domer growth model. Then there are theories and patterns of structural change, international dependency revolution, and the classical free market counter revolution. In recent years, an heterogeneous approach has emerged that draws on all of these classic theories. So let me start with linear stages growth model. The theories of 1950s and 60s viewed the process of development as a series of successive stages of economic growth through which all countries must pass. It was primarily an economic theory of development in which the right quantity and mixture of saving, investment, and foreign aid were all that was necessary to enable developing nations to proceed along an economic growth path that had historically been followed by the more developed nations of the Western world. Development thus became synonymous with rapid aggregate economic growth. This approach was replaced in the 1970s by two competing models of thought, that is the structural change and international dependency theory. The first, which focused on the theories and patterns of structural change, used modern economic theory and statistical analysis in an attempt to portray the internal process of structural change that a typical developing country must undergo if it is to succeed in generating and sustaining rapid economic growth. Then there is the dependency theory, that is international dependence school of thought. This was more radical and more political, and it viewed underdevelopment in terms of international and domestic power relationships, institutional and structural economic rigidities, and the resulting proliferation of dual economies and dual societies both within and among the nations of the world. Dependence theories tended to emphasize external and internal institutional and political constraints on economic development. Emphasis was based on the need for major new policies to eradicate poverty, to provide more diversified employment opportunities, and to reduce income inequalities. These and other egalitarian objectives were to be achieved within the context of a growing economy, but economic growth per se was not given the exalted status according to it by the linear stages and structural change models. Then we have neoclassical counter-revolution. Throughout much of the 1980s and 1990s, a fourth approach prevailed, that is the neoclassical counter-revolution. This counter-revolution in economic thought emphasized the beneficial role of free markets, open economies, and privatization of inefficient public enterprises. Failure to develop, according to this theory, is not due to exploitative external and internal forces as expounded by dependency theorists. Rather, it is primarily the result of too much government intervention and regulation of the economy. Then we have postmodernist approach. The postmodernist approach, which remains dominant since 1990s, is a diverse approach that draws on all of these perspectives. So we also will discuss four broad approaches to development. So one is classical traditional approach. Traditional approaches regarded developing countries as being characterized by dualistic structure, where comparisons were made between the backward and advanced, the barbarian and the civilized, and the traditional and the modern societies. Dualism is seen between the traditional indigenous underdeveloped sector versus the modern developed and westernized culture sector. Underdevelopment is an initial state beyond which the West has managed to progress. The experience of the West can assist other countries to bring them to modern age of capitalism and liberal democracy. To start with, a Hirschman presenting the neoclassical position of polarization or an unbalanced development strategy with investment concentrated in few sectors to create demand for other sectors, and thus the inevitable trickling down from one sector to another, one group to another, and the developed to the underdeveloped, all without government intervention. Friedman and Weaver summed up this position like this: inequality was efficient for growth, equality was inefficient, so that given these assumptions about economic growth, the expansion of manufacturing was regarded as the major propulsive force. This postulation, based as it was on the modernization thesis, gained currency both in theory and practice during 50s and 60s. Unequal and uneven growth, modernization, and urban industrialization, the diffusion of innovations, and the hierarchic patterns of change and growth poles constitute the top-down paradigm of development. This paradigm advocates the establishment of strong urban industrial nodes as the basis of self-sustained growth and is premised on the occurrence of strong trickle-down effects, by means of which Through time, it is believed that modernization will inexorably be spread from urban to rural areas. A key theory in this paradigm was Rostow's theory of stages of economic growth. The staunch anti-communist Rostow, in his book The Stages of Economic Development, offered the roadmap of economic development in few simple rules of Western capitalist model. It was the leading thinking under Kennedy, Johnson, and President Nixon. The central argument was that developing nations needed to industrialize in order to develop. The various approaches that could be followed in pursuing this aim include import substitution industrialization or inward-looking policy, and industrialization by invitation, as well as big push industrial programs. This is the famous Rostow's stages of economic growth, in which there are 5 stages. That is traditional society, then we have precondition for takeoff, then there is takeoff stage, then we have drive to maturity, and the last and the highest stage of economic development is the age of mass consumption, or the stage of high mass consumption. It would be wrong, however, to give impression that the focus on top-down urban industrial growth linked to the quest for modernization was associated with a single and unified path. 4 more or less distinct development strategies making up the early Western tradition can be identified. The liberal model, that is the laissez-faire market fundamentalism; the Keynesian model, state intervention to stimulate growth; the state capitalist model, from agro-based to industry-driven economic development model; the Soviet model, that is agri-mechanized, industry periodized, state replaced market. The historical empirical approach. Towards the end of 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s, several scholars came up with empirical studies with an historical dimension showing that without intervention, development is likely to become increasingly polarized in transitional societies. The best known among them was American planner John Friedman's, who came up with his core periphery model. Friedman's model is one which suggests that in theory, economic development will lead to the convergence of regional incomes and welfare differentials. But in reality, there was evidence of persistent disequilibrium that historical evidence does not support it. Hence, trickle-down is outpaced by polarization, and this state intervention is imperative. The second important reading was 5 stages mercantile model that stressed the historical evolutionary viewpoint in examining the development of national patterns of development and change. It highlighted that development took place in stage in a linear historical fashion, beginning with search for coasts, markets, and colonies for gradual and ultimate control and systematic growth in industrialization and trade. Another variant of mercantilist model is Plantopolis model, which starts with the plantation as self-contained basis for settlement and lead to further economic expansion and domination of the colonies, and ultimately to highly polarized economic development. The historical empirical approach helps us understand the historical evolution of development, the gradual and linear urbanization, penetration, and expansion during colonialism, that this linear historical process culminated in dependency, special concentration, and economic polarization between the West and the rest. The radical dependency approach. This approach was also seen as response from periphery indigenous societies vis-a-vis the Eurocentric approaches. Dependency approach was a rebuttal of modernization theory, although German-born economist A.G. Frank was its leading exponent. Most of the work came from Latin American countries. Paul Baran's Marxist framework envisaged that during the colonial period, advanced nations entered into special partnerships with powerful elite groups in less developed and pre-capitalist countries. Thus, surplus was extracted and appropriated by elite groups. Latin American and Caribbean radical scholars, including Paul Prebisch and Furtado, are the best known structuralists within the dependency camp because they focused on the unseen structures that may be held to shape society. Prebisch stressed the importance of economic relations in linking industrialized and Latin American less developed countries, observing center-periphery relations among them. Furtado argued that present-day Latin American socio-economic structures were the result of the manner of incorporation into the world capitalist system, an argument which is close to the full dependency line. The Caribbean-based New World Group, established in 1992, tried to identify indigenous paths for the region's development. They were convinced that the twin strands of modernization and industrialization were not suited to the region. A.G. Frank maintained that development and underdevelopment are opposite sides of the same coin, and that both are the necessary outcomes and manifestations of the contradictions of the capitalist system of development. In his The Development of Underdevelopment thesis, Frank argued that the condition for developing countries is not the outcome of inertia, misfortune, chance, climatic conditions, or whatever, but rather a reflection of the manner for their incorporation into the global capitalist system. As such, the so-called underdevelopment and associated dualism are not a negative or void, but the direct outcome of reciprocal of development elsewhere. Dependency theorists argued that the chain of exploitative relations witnessed the extraction and transmission of surplus value via a process of unequal exchange extending from the peasant through the market town, regional center, national capital to the international metropole. This way, surplus value has been siphoned off from the poor to the rich countries since the colonial era. The alternative bottom-up participatory approaches. The term another development has been used to denote the watershed in thinking which has characterized the period since the mid-1970s. It emphasized that self-reliance be made central to the development process, emphasis be placed on internal rather than external forces of change, development should meet basic needs of the people, development needed to be ecologically sensitive, the principles of public participation should lead development process. Additionally, these approaches assert there is not just one linear path to development. Economic growth alone is not development. Top-down policies have perpetuated, at times aggravated, poverty, hence the need for bottom-up policies. Equal emphasis on the rural development rather than just urban development. Local communities and livelihoods be protected from the industrial system dominated by the elite few. Then we have bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach emphasizes that development from below needs to be closely related to specific socio-cultural, historical, and institutional conditions. Similarly stated, development should be based on territorial units and should endeavor to mobilize their indigenous natural human resources. More particularly, the approach is based on the use of indigenous resources, self-reliance, and appropriate technology, plus a range of other things such as rural-urban transport and communication, egalitarian social structure, and broad access to land, etc. Development and change should not be concentrated at levels of the social and settlement systems, but should focus on the needs of the lower echelons of these respective orders. It is this characteristic which give rise to the term bottom-up development. Basic needs approach. The provision of basic needs became a major focus during the early 1970s. The idea of basic needs originated with a group of Latin American theorists and was officially launched at the International Labour Organization's World Employment Conference that was held in 1976. This approach posits that since growth didn't mitigate poverty as expected under the top-down urban industrial neoliberalism model of development, in third world, there was need for creating employment and redistribution of wealth for the poor segments to address their basic needs. It was soon adopted by the major global organizations such as United Nations, International Labour Organization, and the World Bank, etc. Later on, we had the theory of sustainable development. Since the 70s, environmental consciousness in the arena of development thinking has emerged, triggered by the Brundtland Commissions on Environment and Development, strengthened by the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and subsequent events. The need for emancipatory views on women and development and ethnicity and development has also started to receive the attention that it merits. There is the assumption of implicit fairness or justice within sustainable development, so the poor and disadvantaged are not forced to degrade or pollute their environments in order to be able to survive on a day-to-day basis. In this sense, sustainable development means more than preserving natural biological systems. Now we come to participatory development ideas. This was an alternative approach that include participatory development based on the idea of more equitable development, given the long hegemony of the so-called top-down planning, Western rational planning and development. Increasing the involvement of people in their own development is seen by many as imperative. As the state has progressively withdrawn from specific areas during the new liberal era, so the organizations existing between family groups and the state have become more and more important. This way, civil society has emerged as the third sector after the state and market, and NGOs are a major component of the civil society. Social capital, understood as the set of social norms that promote cooperation between and among individuals and groups, is an important force in the civil society driven development. Participation is to be both at planning and implementation level according to the participatory development model of development. We also will discuss postmodernist approach to development. From modernism, mankind has entered a postmodern age, an age associated with the rise of knowledge-based post-industrial economy, a rejection of grand theories, greater plurality and hybridity. The whole ethos of the modern period privileged the metropolitan, urban over the rural provinces, developed over the developing worlds, North America over the Pacific Rim, professional expert over the general populace, men over women. Postmodernist ethos is characterized by diversity of approaches which may serve to empower other alternative voices and cultures. A strong emphasis on bottom-up, non-hierarchical growth strategies which endeavor to get away from the international sameness and depthlessness of the modernist outlook. Focus on rural, backward, smaller, peripheral places rather than those at the center, urban nodes of development. Horizontal rather than hierarchical, participatory rather than imposed design and implementation of development programs. Less certain, less monolithic, and multi-directional approach. Period of dominance of development thought. So these are classified under different decades. So mid 1940s and 50s there were modernization theories, structuralist theories, and then during the 60s development theories of dependency theories of development was developed, and then we had basic needs approach, new Malthusian theories, women and development during the 1970s. Then during the 1980s there was the rise of the new liberalism, sustainable development, gender and development. In 1990s and 2000 and onward, we have post development, that is ideas, but development represent a form of colonialism and Eurocentrism, should be challenged from the grassroots. Culture and development, increased awareness of how different social and cultural groups are affected by development process. Grassroots participatory approaches instead of top-down planning, urban-focused, polarized, trickle-down model. Development should be bottom-up, participatory, and inclusive. We also have some development models. Since the end of the World War II, models of development have changed based on political, economic, and social needs. These development models were based on several assumptions. The model works everywhere, but it can be universally applied without regard to specific cultural patterns. This is referred to as under differentiation, or the failure to recognize that cultural norms vary. Non-monetary systems are backward. Any economic exchange that didn't rely on the market system was inherently inferior. Traditional lifeways were viewed as an impediment to development. There is a common destiny of society, and the common good arises out of the pursuit of individual self-interest. Living standards can be quantified with a monetary index, gross national product, and life expectancy. Basically, they assumed that wealth is equal to happiness. Number one, we have the modernization model. This model is focused on change through economic growth, material progress through industrialization, market expansion, and technological innovation are key components. Is a democratic political system which consolidated power vested in the state. Material progress would result in better lives for the citizenry even if the environment and society suffered. Critics of this cookie-cutter approach to development claim that it is not sustainable because of high consumption levels of resources. Anthropological research indicates that this model is detrimental to indigenous peoples as their land and resources are subsumed by the state and sold or leased to corporations for resource extraction, leading to destruction of their cultures. This model also encourages reduction in both cultural and biodiversity. We have growth-oriented development models. Drawing on the modernization model and Rostow's stages of growth theory, the growth-oriented development model proposes that a trickle-down effect will occur when there is investment in economic growth. As wealth increases for those investing in economic growth, some of the wealth will make its way down to those less well off, thereby positively impacting human welfare. Participation in the international market and industrialization of both agriculture and manufacturing are two key elements. Privatization of public services is also imperative. This may be familiar as these ideas are incorporated in the World Bank and International Monetary Fund structural adjustment policies. One of the criticisms of this model is that it ignores the fact that underdeveloped nations didn't have a history of development. Such is not the case. Many indigenous societies had well-established trade with other groups both close by and long distance. There were also lucrative indigenous industries such as the Indian textile industry mentioned previously. This model concentrates resources into the hands of the few, creating marked inequality in the society. Recent research and criticism focuses on the unsustainability of this model of development. Number three, distributed development models, not over innovation. Growing out of the criticism of the trickle-down effect, the distributional development model is concerned with social equity. The distributional development model claims that no development program will work without ensuring that there is equitable access to resources for all. Number four, human development model. In this model, the focus is on the investment in the human welfare, better education, healthcare, security, and safety, with the belief that it will lead to economic growth. Sustainable development model. Probably the most recent development model, sustainable development focuses on the conservation of non-renewable resources and in some cases survival of indigenous peoples. This model also proposes investment in development projects that are financially sustainable over time. Then we have indigenous development model. Indigenous development models draw on local cultural practices to promote realistic change. Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this was informative regarding the view on development models, growth and strategies, and its historical development.